The wind that crossed the Arizona plains that evening carried more than dust. It carried a quiet ache that belonged to a man who had forgotten the sound of laughter. The sun sagged low, casting its molten glow across the horizon, and the earth shimmered with heat that refused to die with the day. Josiah Caldwell sat on the porch of his solitary cabin, a silhouette cut from silence, his hands still and weathered like the wood beneath him. Somewhere far away, a coyote called out, a sound that didn't echo so much as dissolve into the vast emptiness. It had been 6 years since the smallpox took everything. 6 years since he'd buried Elizabeth and little Sarah beneath the cottonwood tree where the soil never seemed to stay settled. Sometimes he still woke believing he could hear his child's laugh. Sometimes he wished he couldn't. The bottle on the porch beside him caught the fading sunlight, amber liquid burning in its depths like the last flame of a dying hearth. He turned it slowly in his hand, the glass warm against his palm. He had promised himself he would stop drinking, but promises were for men who still had something to look forward to. Each sip blurred the edges of memory, dulling the sharp ache of voices lost too soon. The world outside seemed to sleep, but his mind roamed restless, haunted by the faces of soldiers, fever victims, by the hollow eyes of his wife when he'd arrived too late. He had once been a healer. Now he was a ghost that pretended to live. Yet even ghosts sometimes are called back to life by something unexpected. The sound reached him faintly at first, a crack in the rhythm of the desert evening, a distant thunder, low and wrong, hoofbeats. No. Closer now, the echo of chaos carried by the wind. Then a thin column of smoke rose over the ridge beyond the valley. He set the bottle aside, heart thudding, that long dormant instinct stirring like a wounded bird, trouble not far. He should have ignored it. He should have stayed where he was, but his body was already moving before the thought could take form. He saddled his mule with hands that remembered urgency better than peace. The rifle felt too familiar in his grasp, an old companion from darker years. As he rode toward the smoke, the scent of gunpowder drifted on the air. Acrid, metallic, a ghost of battlefields past. He followed the trail until the ground itself seemed to change beneath his eyes. Wagon wheels carved deep scars in the dirt, and bodies lay where the desert had no right to hold them. Blue coats, grey coats. It didn't matter. Death wore the same expression on every face. He dismounted, the dry wind tugging at his coat. His breath caught when he heard a sound that didn't belong to the dead, a faint, trembling exhale, soft as prayer. Behind an overturned wagon, half buried in shadow, lay a woman, shackled wrists, torn dress, blood caked into her hair. Her skin, dark as sun-baked clay, gleamed with sweat and pain. When her eyes opened, he froze. They were the color of midnight, deep, unflinching, wild. He had seen fear, seen defiance, seen pleading, but never that calm, steady stillness. He knelt beside her, feeling the familiar rhythm of duty slide back into his bones. "You're hurt," he said, though she gave no answer. Her lips moved, whispering something in a language he didn't know. Her chains glinted in the failing light, heavy with rust and blood. The marks on her wrists told him everything about her captivity. He should have turned away, ridden to the fort, told them where to find their missing prisoner. That would have been safer. That would have been the law. Instead, he cut the chain. When the metal fell, a strange hush filled the air. She looked at him as though trying to understand his madness. He didn't have words for it himself, only that somewhere in the hollow place where grief had taken root, something had begun to stir again. Perhaps it was compassion, perhaps it was guilt. But it was enough to make him lift her into his arms and carry her toward the waiting dusk. By the time they reached his cabin, the sky had darkened to the color of ash. He laid her on his narrow bed, lit a lamp, and saw her face clearly for the first time, sharp-boned, strong, streaked with dried blood, her breath hitched, shallow and uneven. He fetched water, tore strips from a clean shirt, and began to clean her wounds. When he touched the gash on her forehead, she flinched but didn't cry out. There was a quiet strength in her stillness, something that humbled him. "I was a doctor," he murmured, half to himself. "I can help." Her gaze flicked toward the rifle propped against the wall, then back to his face. "Why?" she whispered, her English halting, thick with accent. "Why help?" The question hung between them, simple, piercing, impossible. He didn't answer, not yet. He wrapped the bandage around her head, careful, almost reverent, as if in binding her wound he might bind something broken inside himself. Outside, the desert wind sighed through the creosote, carrying the scent of rain that never came. Inside, two strangers breathed the same air, a man running from the past, and a woman who had survived the impossible. When the night deepened, he sat by the fire, watching her sleep. Her face softened in rest, the hard lines of fear eased by exhaustion. He thought of Elizabeth, of Sarah, of the countless lives he couldn't save. Yet this one, this fierce, wounded soul, was still breathing. That was something. Maybe everything. He poured himself a drink, but didn't touch it. The warmth of the fire was enough tonight. For the first time in years, he found comfort not in forgetting, but in remembering that he could still care. Healing begins not when the pain ends, but when the heart dares to feel again. The lamp flickered low, casting gold across the wooden walls, and his eyes grew heavy. He didn't pray. He hadn't in years, but as he drifted towards sleep, he found himself whispering words that felt like prayer all the same. Let her live. Just let her live. When dawn came, he woke to silence, broken only by the soft rustle of movement. She was awake, sitting upright, the blanket falling from her shoulders. Her eyes met his, guarded but alive. It startled him how much light that single moment carried. She watched him with cautious awareness, as if measuring the distance between gratitude and distrust. He offered her water. She accepted, hands trembling slightly. When she spoke again, her voice was clearer. "They will come," she said. "Soldiers. They think I am dead." He nodded, knowing she was right. He should have felt fear. Instead, he felt clarity. He couldn't change what he had done. He wouldn't undo it. The law could hang him, the army could call him traitor. None of it mattered now. The desert outside glowed with morning fire, and he saw it differently than before. For years he had believed it barren, lifeless, but in that light the colors shifted. Ochre, gold, crimson, endless and alive. Maybe the world had been waiting all along for him to open his eyes again. He turned to the woman. "What's your name?" Her gaze lingered on him before she answered. "Nalin." The name rolled softly through the room like the whisper of rain. He repeated it quietly, and something inside him settled. From that day, the rhythm of their existence changed. He tended his crops and mended tools by day. By night, He changed her bandages, fed the fire, and listened to her speak in fragments of her world, of mountains and rivers, of songs sung in the mother tongue of her people. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the ache beneath them. She, in turn, learned his silences, his way of retreating into thought. Between them grew a language that needed no translation, a glance, a shared breath, a pause that said, "You are safe here." Still, the shadow of pursuit hung over them like the edge of a storm. In the distance, he sometimes saw dust trails rising where riders might be. At night, he dreamed of soldiers pounding on his door, of fire consuming the cabin. Yet each morning he chose to stay. Each sunrise was a quiet act of defiance. And in the stillness between fear and hope, something gentle began to take root. He caught himself smiling one morning as she scolded him for working too hard, her tone more healer than fugitive. He saw her eyes soften when he spoke of the flowers his daughter once planted by the fence. He found that her laughter, rare and quiet as it was, made the air in the cabin feel less empty. It wasn't love yet, not in the way of young hearts. It was something deeper, slower, something that felt like healing itself, the slow stitching together of two lives torn open by loss. Outside, the desert began to bloom again. The rains finally came, timid but persistent, and the dry ground drank like a soul learning to hope. He watched from the doorway as Nalin stood beneath the drizzle, face turned to the sky, eyes closed, letting the water run over her scars. It struck him then that the world, despite everything, still knew how to soften, and in that fragile moment he began to believe that maybe people could too. Some stories begin with fire and fury. Theirs began with quiet, with the sound of chains falling, with rain finding its way back to the earth. As the light fell across them, Josiah thought he could almost feel Elizabeth's voice in the wind, not accusing this time, but forgiving. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. Danger, perhaps death. But for the first time in years, he was not afraid of it. He only knew that whatever road waited ahead, he would walk it with open eyes, and maybe, just maybe, someone out there, listening, watching, feeling this story unfold, might find in it a breath of calm, a flicker of hope, a reminder that love, in its purest form, is the most healing thing that still survives in a broken world. If this story touched something quiet inside you, leave a small sign, a thought, a comment, a light. Let it ripple outward the way kindness does in forgotten places. Follow this journey, stay close, and let's keep walking this road together. Toward warmth, toward peace, toward the gentle miracle of being human again. The days that followed unfolded like slow-moving clouds, soft at the edges, tinted with the faint color of something almost forgotten. Peace. Morning sunlight slid across the wooden floor of the cabin, touching everything with quiet forgiveness. Josiah woke earlier than before, out of habit perhaps, but also because he liked the way the light reached the corner where she slept. Nalin still rested deeply, her breathing even, one arm curled protectively over her ribs. There was something calming about the sight, something that told him the world hadn't ended after all. It had only grown quieter, waiting for courage to return. He would rise, set the coffee to boil, and listen to the small sounds of the desert stirring to life outside, the faint coo of morning doves, the dry rustle of mesquite. Sometimes, while the water heated, he would catch himself humming without realizing it. It startled him every time. He hadn't made a sound of contentment in years. When Nalin finally stirred, he poured her a cup, careful not to meet her eyes too soon. Trust was fragile. You had to warm it slowly, like morning fire coaxed from fading embers. She took the cup with both hands, wincing slightly as the heat touched her palms, but her voice, when she thanked him, carried a hint of softness that hadn't been there before. Their conversations grew longer as her strength returned. At first, they were simple exchanges. How her wounds felt, when he'd last gone to town, how far away the fort might be. But as the days slipped by, they wandered into gentler terrain. She spoke of rivers that ran like silver veins through her homeland, of nights when her people sang to the stars, each voice a thread in a fabric of belonging. Her English was broken, yet her stories carried rhythm, a pulse that filled the silence like music. Josiah listened. More than that, he felt. He felt the pulse of the life she came from, a world he had never seen but could almost imagine, the scent of pine after rain, the laughter of children near firelight, the drum of hooves across open ground. There was pain in her memories too, but it was the kind that shaped rather than destroyed. In her words, grief became a bridge, not a grave. One afternoon, while he was chopping wood outside, he heard her voice drifting through the cabin window, soft and melodic, a song without words. It was unlike any melody he'd known, low, haunting, tender. He stopped mid-swing and just listened. It wasn't for him. It was for herself, for healing. Yet, somehow, it found him anyway, slipping through the cracks of all he thought was beyond repair. Inside, she sat by the table, weaving something with strips of torn cloth, patterns only she understood. The tune rose and fell, like breath, like prayer. Josiah stood at the door, watching, unwilling to break the spell. He realized then that her presence had changed the air around him. It felt alive again, scented faintly with sage and something more elusive, hope. That evening, while she rested, he wandered outside and looked toward the distant ridge. The smoke from that first day had long since vanished, but its memory lingered like a reminder that choices made in mercy never truly die. The sky was a violet ocean spilling into darkness, and for the first time in years he wished someone could see it beside him. When he returned inside, Nalin was awake, sitting by the lamp, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. She looked at him with that steady gaze that always seemed to reach deeper than words. "You look," she said slowly, searching for the phrase, "like a man who remembers something gentle." Her words caught him off guard. He smiled faintly. "Maybe I do." "You should keep it," she said. "Gentle is strong." He thought about that long after she'd fallen asleep. Gentle is strong. It was the opposite of everything the world had taught him. The army, the war, the endless fight for survival, yet somehow it rang true. There was strength in kindness, in the quiet act of staying when it would be easier to turn away. The following morning, while tending the small garden out back, he found her watching him from the doorway, arms crossed loosely. "You grow medicine," she observed, pointing to the herbs he'd planted long ago with Elizabeth. "These plants heal." "They used to," he said. "I suppose they still can." She walked toward him, slow, deliberate. Kneeling beside the patch, she brushed her fingers over the leaves. "This one," she murmured, "for fever. This one, for spirit." Her tone was reverent, as if speaking to the plants themselves. When earth gives healing, we say thank you. He studied her profile, the way her lips curved gently as she spoke, the glint of morning sunlight in her hair. And to whom do you say it? To everything, she answered simply. To wind, to sun, to the hand that does the healing. He swallowed hard, the weight of her simplicity disarming. Then I'll say thank you too. The moment lingered, fragile and golden, like the first light after a storm. They worked side by side that morning, tending to the small patch of green that had become their shared ground. She moved with grace despite her healing ribs, every motion deliberate, meaningful. He tried not to notice how the air around her seemed to shimmer slightly when she smiled. That afternoon, as heat swelled and cicadas sang their relentless chorus, Josiah sat by the table mending a broken chair leg. Nalin was at the window, tracing patterns in the thin layer of dust on the sill. The stillness between them was easy now, companionable, but peace, he had learned, was always temporary. From far off came the echo of hooves, slow at first, then clearer. His hands stilled. Nalin's eyes flicked to him, sharp and alert. They listened together, the sound threading closer until it fractured the quiet completely. He moved to the window, heart tightening. Just one rider, maybe two. Dust rose like a thin veil behind them. Not soldiers, perhaps, but he couldn't risk it. He turned to Nalin. Hide. Without a word, she slipped through the back door, moving toward the barn. He waited until the sound of her steps faded before opening the front door just as the rider approached. It was Walter Reed, the storekeeper from town, his old friend, the one man who still spoke to him kindly. Relief loosened Josiah's chest, yet the expression on Walter's face was not casual. It carried the grimness of news that never traveled alone. "They're searching," Walter said without preamble. "Army patrol. Fort Whipple's been buzzing like a hornet nest. Some say the prisoner's still alive. They're posting rewards." Josiah's throat went dry. $50? Walter's eyes narrowed. "You know about it already?" He forced a shrug. "Heard talk on the road." Walter sighed. "You always had a bad talent for trouble. Hayes is leading the search himself." "Mean bastard, that one. You'd best keep clear of the back trails for a while." "I will," Josiah said. "Thank you, Walter." As his friend rode off, Josiah stood still, the warning echoing in his mind like thunder across open ground. He waited until the dust settled before going to the barn. The trap door to the cellar creaked open, and Nalin's face appeared, pale in the dim light. "They will not stop," she said quietly when she saw his expression. "No," he replied, "but neither will I." That night, sleep refused to come. He sat by the fire, her soft breathing behind him, and stared at the flames until they blurred. Each choice drew him further from the man he had been and closer to something he didn't yet recognize. It should have frightened him. Instead, it felt almost holy. When dawn came, the desert seemed gentler, as though it too had chosen silence over judgment. Nalin joined him outside, leaning lightly against the porch post. "The wind changes," she said. "It brings new paths." He looked out toward the horizon where light bled into gold. "Then we follow it," he said. The words felt like a vow, though neither of them spoke of it again. In the days that followed, they lived between caution and calm, watching the distant hills, working the land, learning each other's quiet ways. She began to move more freely around the cabin, her fear fading with every sunrise. He caught her humming sometimes while grinding herbs, the melody soft as breath. He found himself listening not for danger anymore, but for her. When she smiled, it startled him. Gentle, fleeting, but real. It reminded him of a door opening inside his chest. One evening, after a supper of beans and cornbread, she sat by the doorway while he whittled a small piece of cedar into the shape of a bird. She watched in silence until he finished. "For what do you carve?" she asked. He hesitated, holding the small figure up to the firelight. "For my daughter," he said softly. "I used to make toys for her." Her eyes dimmed with understanding. "You loved them deeply." "I still do," he admitted. "Even when there's no one left to love back." She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand, light as the whisper of wind through grass. "Love doesn't die," she said. "It only waits to be needed again." The warmth of her touch lingered long after she pulled away. He placed the small bird on the windowsill. "Then let it watch over us," he murmured. The air inside the cabin grew tender, like something fragile learning to breathe. Outside, the stars scattered themselves across the black canvas of sky, and the scent of rain drifted through the open window. As Nalin lay down to rest, Josiah remained awake, listening to her quiet breathing. For the first time since his world had fallen apart, he didn't feel like the last man alive. There was another heartbeat beside his, steady, real. Healing came not as a sudden revelation, but as small, invisible acts, the way she touched the herbs with gratitude, the way he saved the warmest part of the bread for her, the way silence no longer ached. The nights grew cooler, the fire burned lower, and something unseen wove itself between them, gentle and patient. Not yet love, but the beginning of it. The quiet promise of something more than survival. Outside, the moon climbed higher, spilling silver over the desert. Inside, two souls, one haunted by guilt, the other by loss, breathed in rhythm, each unaware that the other had become their reason to stay alive. The cabin, once a tomb of memory, now pulsed faintly with life again. And somewhere in that fragile glow, Josiah realized that the woman sleeping beneath his roof was not a burden he had taken on, but a blessing he had been given. He didn't know where this path would lead, whether it would end in freedom or ruin, but he no longer cared. For now, he was exactly where he needed to be. The night folded around them like a prayer, soft and wordless. Healing had come quietly, disguised as companionship, as trust, as the faint brush of warmth between two wounded hearts learning to live again. And as the dawn whispered over the horizon, spilling gold through the window, Josiah felt a strange peace settle inside him. Whatever storms were coming, he would face them, not alone, not this time. He looked once more at the carved bird on the sill, caught in the first light of morning, and smiled. Some wings, he thought, are not for flying away, but for finding your way home. The next morning, the sky unfurled itself in soft layers of rose and amber, and the desert awoke like something sacred. A pale mist clung low to the valley before dissolving under the rising light. Josiah stood outside, sleeves rolled to his elbows, washing his face in the basin. The water was cold, sharp enough to remind him he was still alive. Behind him, the door creaked softly, and he turned to see Nalin stepping into the sunlight, her dark hair loosely braided, the white bandage at her temple now replaced by clean linen. The color had returned to her skin, no longer ghost pale. She paused at the edge of the porch, barefoot, breathing in the morning air. For a long while, she said nothing, simply looked out over the expanse that stretched endlessly to the mountains. The light touched her gently, and Josiah saw how different she seemed now, less a fugitive, more a spirit reborn. He wondered if she saw the same in him. "I dreamed," she said quietly, eyes still on the horizon. He waited. "In my dream, I walked through smoke. The ground was burning. Then rain came, soft like feathers. It fell on my hands and turned to light." He nodded, his heart tightening with a strange understanding. Dreams like that mean something. "Yes," she said. "They mean the heart is trying to heal." The word hung between them, tender and trembling. Heal. After breakfast, Josiah saddled the mule. "I need to go into town," he told her. "We're running low on salt, flour, coffee too." Her brows drew together. "It's not safe." "I'll be careful. If anyone comes while I'm gone, go to the cellar. Don't come out till I call." She hesitated, then nodded. "I will wait." Her voice carried a trust that weighed heavy and warm inside him. He rode out under the growing sun, following the familiar winding trail through the scrubland. Each mile tightened the knot in his chest. Copper Springs would be different now. The army would have spread its web. Yet he couldn't hide forever. Not if they were to survive. When the small town finally appeared, a cluster of sun-baked buildings framed by dust, he slowed his mule and straightened his shoulders, practicing the calm of a man with nothing to hide. The smell of coffee, tobacco, and horse sweat drifted through the air. He dismounted outside Reed's General Store, tying the mule loosely to the post. The bell above the door gave its usual tired ring when he entered. Walter Reed looked up from behind the counter, his wrinkled face creasing into something halfway between welcome and worry. "Josiah," he said, "didn't expect you so soon." "Ran out of a few things." Walter's hands moved automatically, gathering items. "Flour, salt, coffee, same as always." Josiah nodded. "And some bandages." That made the older man pause. "Bandages?" "Old war wounds been acting up," Josiah said smoothly, though he could feel the lie tighten against his throat. Walter's gaze lingered, but he said nothing. He wrapped the items in brown paper, scribbled down the total, and hesitated again. "You hear about the trouble on the Fort Whipple Road?" Josiah kept his voice even. "No. What kind of trouble?" "Army transport ambushed. 6 men dead. 1 prisoner escaped, a woman, Apache." Josiah's stomach turned to stone. "You don't say." "They say she's dangerous. Chief Takakota's sister. $50 reward for her capture." Walter slid a folded paper across the counter. "Sketch ain't much, but you'll see these posted all over soon enough." Josiah unfolded the notice. The drawing was crude, but the sharp cheekbones and defiant eyes were unmistakable. He fought to keep his face still. "I'll keep an eye out," he said. Walter leaned in a little, lowering his voice. "You be careful. Some of the army boys riding through town, they've got a mean look about them. Hayes especially. He won't stop till he finds her." Josiah's jaw tightened. "Hayes?" he repeated quietly. "He's leading the search." "Leading it and enjoying every bit of it." Josiah paid, thanked him, and turned to leave, but Walter's hand caught his arm. "You got a good heart, Josiah. Just don't let it get you killed." He forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'll keep that in mind." Outside, the sun burned brighter, and the street shimmered with heat. He loaded his supplies onto the mule, mind racing. He had to get back before anyone followed, but as he adjusted the last strap, shouting broke out down the street. A crowd was gathering near the saloon. Curiosity tugged at him, and before he could stop himself, he edged closer. At the center of the commotion stood Lieutenant Hayes. His blue uniform was spotless, his posture sharp with self-importance. Two soldiers held a man between them, a Mexican trader Josiah recognized from the outskirts. The man's face was bloodied, his hands bound. Hayes addressed the townspeople in a voice as smooth as polished steel. "This man was found with stolen army property. He admits to trading with the Apache band responsible for the ambush. Let this be a reminder. Harboring enemies of the United States is treason." He looked around, eyes cold as glass. "Anyone who helps the escaped prisoner will hang." The words fell like stones. Around Josiah, men nodded grimly. Fear and hate were easy things to stir. He turned away before the nausea rising in him could show on his face. He left town in silence, the warning echoing with each hoofbeat. The desert stretched ahead, wide and merciless, but it felt safer than any man's company. When the cabin finally came into view, he saw no sign of disturbance. Still, his heart thudded as he dismounted, scanning the quiet yard. "Nalin," he called softly. A rustle answered him from the shadows of the barn. She stepped out, knife in hand, then lowered it when she saw him. "You came back." "I said I would." Her eyes searched his face. "What did you learn?" He hesitated. "They're looking for you." "Hayes is leading it himself." At the name, something dark flickered across her features. "He enjoys the hunt," she said quietly. "He does," Josiah admitted, "and he won't stop." She stood still for a long moment, then said, "Then I will not stay hidden forever." "You'll stay until you're healed," he said firmly. "Then we'll decide what comes next." Her gaze softened. "We," she repeated, as if testing the word. "You speak like I belong." He met her eyes. "You do, for now." That night, while she slept, Josiah sat by the fire again, staring into the flames. He thought of Hayes's voice, of the crowd's silence, of Walter's warning. Each memory pressed against his chest until breathing felt heavy. But then he looked toward the bed, where Nalin lay wrapped in the quilt, her face peaceful for the first time since he had found her. Something inside him quieted. He had lived years buried in loss, feeding guilt until it hollowed him out. Yet now, in this fragile truce between two broken worlds, there was a small, pulsing thing that refused to die. Hope. Healing doesn't come like sunlight. It comes like the faint warmth before dawn, almost unnoticed until the darkness begins to lift. Days passed. She grew stronger, walking the small perimeter of the cabin, learning its silence, its safety. He found her outside one morning, tending to the garden, her fingers brushing the soil gently, reverently. "You shouldn't be out here," he said, though there was no sharpness in his voice. "The earth doesn't fear the sun," she answered. "Why should I?" He couldn't argue. Together they watered the plants, quiet and steady. It struck him then how natural it felt, the rhythm of shared work, of breathing the same air, Each moment, ordinary yet alive, felt like stitching a torn seam back together. As evening fell, they ate in the fading light, the air thick with the scent of sage. The fire crackled softly. After a while she looked up from her bowl. "Do you believe in forgiveness?" He set his spoon down, surprised. "I don't know any more." "I think forgiveness is like the wind," she said slowly. "You can't see it, but it changes everything it touches." He smiled faintly. "And what if it never comes?" "Then we keep breathing until it does." Her words lingered long after. That night he dreamed of rain again. Not the torrential kind that floods and destroys, but the gentle kind that coaxes life from barren ground. He woke with tears on his face, though he couldn't tell if they belonged to grief or grace. The next afternoon brought wind from the east, heavy with dust. Nalin was sitting outside, weaving something from strips of cloth, patterns intricate and deliberate. He watched her hands move, each motion filled with patience. "What are you making?" he asked. "A sign of journey," she said. "In my tribe, when one leaves home, we tie colors together, red for courage, white for peace, black for memory. When we return, we untie them to show the spirit has found balance again." She lifted her eyes to his. "You carry black still, Josiah Caldwell. Too much memory." He didn't deny it. "Maybe, but I'm trying to learn the others." "Then take this," she said, holding out a small woven band. "So you remember where healing begins." He accepted it wordlessly, the touch of her fingers against his sending something tender through his chest. He tied the band around his wrist. The colors glowed softly in the light. Earth, sky, blood, peace. That night, while the wind moaned outside, he sat awake by the hearth, listening to the slow rhythm of her breathing. He realized how the sound had become part of the cabin itself, as necessary as the creak of the rafters or the hiss of the fire. The emptiness that once swallowed this place had receded, replaced by something living, fragile but real. When she stirred from sleep and saw him still awake, she whispered, "You fear tomorrow?" "Yes," he admitted. "Then we will face it together." Her simple certainty warmed the air around them more than the fire could. Together. How long had it been since he'd felt that word belonged to him? The moon rose high, silvering the world outside. The air carried the scent of sage and rain, and he thought that perhaps God had never left this place, only waited for him to listen again. He leaned back, closing his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt himself begin to rest, not from exhaustion, but from peace. Morning would bring new danger, perhaps soldiers on the ridge, perhaps choices too heavy to bear. But tonight was still, and in its stillness there was healing. He looked once more at Nalin's sleeping form, her face softened in the half-light, and whispered softly, "You've brought life back to this place." Outside the wind eased. The desert held its breath. Somewhere far away, a lone coyote cried out, not in sorrow, but in song. And Josiah knew then that no matter what the coming days would demand of them, something sacred had already begun. Two lost souls had found each other in the ashes, and from that meeting something new was quietly taking root. A love that healed without asking, that promised not escape but understanding, not possession but peace. The fire sank low, embers glowing like stars on the hearth, and he let himself drift, heart open to the uncertain mercy of dawn. The morning began with a stillness so complete it felt like the world was holding its breath. The air was cool and clear, carrying the faint scent of sage and mesquite. A thin veil of light crept through the cabin window, brushing across Nalin's face as she slept, her expression unguarded, peaceful for once. Josiah sat nearby, sharpening a knife, though his eyes strayed to her more often than to the blade. Each morning since she'd come into his life had begun this way, with quiet observation, with gratitude he didn't know how to name. Outside, the desert shimmered beneath the early sun, a vast expanse of gold and silver and silence. The world beyond their small sanctuary remained hostile. Yet here, in this fragile space, time had slowed into something merciful. Healing, he realized, wasn't always loud or sudden. Sometimes it was as soft as the sound of someone else's breathing in the same room, as gentle as light moving across wood. When Nalin awoke, she found him already preparing breakfast, bread warming by the stove, coffee simmering. She moved carefully, mindful of her still healing ribs. "You rise before the sun," she said, her voice husky with sleep. "Old habits," he replied. "The war taught me to move before the light." She poured herself a small cup of coffee, wincing at its bitterness, and smiled faintly. "In my tribe, we rise with the dawn to greet the spirits of the day. They say the first breath you take when the sun rises belongs to life, not sorrow." Josiah nodded. "Then I've been breathing wrong for a long time." Nalin's gaze lingered on him, soft and knowing. "You are learning again." Her words stayed with him long after she stepped outside to tend the small garden. The sun climbed higher, spilling gold across the dusty hills. Josiah spent the morning mending a broken fence near the barn while Nalin gathered herbs nearby. It was a rhythm neither of them had spoken aloud, but had fallen into naturally. He built and repaired. She nurtured and tended. Together they made the silence hum with quiet purpose. But that day the silence was interrupted. It began with the faint tremor of hooves in the distance, barely noticeable at first, like the echo of an old fear. Josiah straightened slowly, hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his belt. His eyes narrowed toward the ridge beyond the cottonwoods. A single speck of movement, then two riders. Nalin sensed it, too. She looked up from the herbs, her body tensing, her instincts as sharp as his. "They come," she said softly. He didn't ask how she knew. The dust plume told him enough. "Go," he said, "to the cellar. Take food and water. Don't make a sound." Without argument, she slipped away toward the barn, her movements swift and silent. He watched until the trapdoor closed behind her, then took up the hoe beside him, forcing his body to remain calm, his face ordinary. Moments later, the first rider came into view, an older man on a chestnut mare, his hat pulled low, shoulders stooped with age. Josiah recognized him instantly. Walter Reed. Relief and dread collided inside him. "Afternoon," Walter called, raising a hand as he dismounted. "Hope I'm not intruding." "You're always welcome," Josiah said carefully. "What brings you out this way?" Walter tied his horse to the post, his expression uneasy. "Wanted to warn you. Hayes and his men are combing the area. Every farm within 20 miles. They've already been through the Donovan Ranch and the Matthews place. It's only a matter of time before they reach you." Josiah's pulse thudded in his throat. "I appreciate the warning." Walter studied him, eyes narrowing. "You're hiding her, aren't you?" The air between them tightened. Josiah said nothing, though the truth hung there like a blade. Walter sighed, running a hand through his grey hair. "I ain't here to turn you in, Josiah, but you need to understand what you're up against. Hayes won't stop. He's got blood in his eyes." "I know," Josiah said quietly. "I've seen that look before." Walter stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If you stay, they'll find her. And you'll both hang." "Where would we go?" Walter hesitated, then glanced toward the north. "My sister's place. Margaret Dawson. Lives near the mountains, off the trail to Prescott. She's kind. Lost her husband in the war. Doesn't hold much love for the army. She might help you." Josiah felt the weight of the choice pressing on him. To leave would mean abandoning everything, his land, the graves, the life he'd clung to as penance. To stay would mean certain death. Behind them, the door to the barn creaked softly. Nalin appeared, knife still in hand, her eyes sharp and unafraid. Walter froze, then slowly removed his hat. "Ma'am," he said, voice low, "you're the one they're hunting." Nalin studied him carefully. "You bring soldiers?" "No," he said quickly. "Only warning." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because she lowered the blade, though her shoulders remained tense. "He risks much," she said to Josiah. Josiah nodded. "He's a friend." Walter exhaled heavily. "You both need to leave by dawn. Hayes is in Copper Springs tonight, but he'll ride this way tomorrow. If he finds you here—" He didn't finish. Josiah offered his hand. "Thank you, Walter." Walter shook it firmly. "Be careful, friend. Some lives are worth more than the land they stand on." After he rode away, silence reclaimed the yard, heavy and thoughtful. Nalin turned to Josiah, her expression unreadable. "You would leave this place, the land of your wife and child?" He looked toward the small hill where two simple markers stood, white stones weathered by years of wind. "Maybe they'd forgive me for it," he said softly. "Maybe it's time I stopped living among ghosts." Her gaze softened. "Sometimes, to honor the dead, we must choose life." He met her eyes. "Then we'll go." That night they packed what they could carry: dried food, water, medicine, a few tools, his rifle. He wrapped Elizabeth's daguerreotype and Sarah's small wooden doll carefully in cloth and placed them in the pack. Everything else he left behind. The cabin looked almost peaceful in the lamplight, its shadows long and familiar. Nalin watched him as he stood by the hearth for a final time. "You built this with your hands," she said. "I did." "And now you walk away." He nodded. "Maybe this is what it means to start again." She stepped closer, her eyes glinting in the soft glow. "Then I will walk with you." Her words carried no hesitation, no fear, only quiet conviction. In that instant, something shifted in him, something fragile and beautiful. It wasn't salvation exactly, but it was the beginning of it. Before dawn, they set out. The mule carried their supplies. The horizon burned faintly with the promise of sunrise. Josiah paused at the edge of the garden Elizabeth had planted long ago, the plants now silvered with dew. He knelt briefly, touching the soil. "Thank you," he whispered, to her, to the land, to whatever mercy had led him here. Then he rose and followed Nalin into the awakening light. They moved north, keeping to the dry creek beds where tracks would fade quickly. The land changed as they went, from rolling desert to low, scrub-covered hills. The sky stretched immense and endless above them. At midday, they stopped beneath a rock outcropping to rest. Nalin drank sparingly, then handed him the waterskin. "We will find the mountains soon," she said. "There are places the soldiers cannot go. Sacred places." He smiled faintly. "Sounds like a good place to hide." "Not to hide," she corrected gently. "To remember." As the heat shimmered around them, Josiah thought of how strange life was, how every step away from what he'd known brought him closer to something that felt like truth. That evening, as dusk painted the sky in bruised colors, they made camp near a dry riverbed. He gathered wood while she built a small fire. When the first sparks caught, she sat close to the warmth, her face glowing amber in the light. He watched her, struck by the quiet dignity in her every movement. The woman he'd first found in chains was gone. In her place sat someone whole, luminous in her strength. After a long silence, she spoke. "When I was taken, I thought my life had ended. Now I see it was only changing shape." Josiah nodded slowly. "I thought the same once." She looked at him then, really looked, and he saw it in her eyes, the same aching recognition, the same fragile hope. "Perhaps," she said softly, "our paths were meant to cross, so both could begin again." The fire cracked, sending sparks into the dark. He wanted to say something, to tell her that her presence had become the steady rhythm of his heart, that she'd already begun to fill the space where sorrow had lived too long. But words felt too small for what was happening between them. Instead, he reached into his pack and took out the woven band she had made him, its colors faintly glowing in the firelight. He touched it gently. "You were right," he said. "Healing begins where we choose to stay." Nalin smiled, soft, real, filled with light. "And where we choose to walk forward." They sat together until the fire burned low, the desert quiet around them. Above, the stars shimmered like distant lanterns, and for the first time, Josiah felt no urge to drink, no need to numb himself against the world. The ache inside him hadn't vanished, but it had changed. It was softer now, a reminder of love rather than loss. When the night grew colder, Nalin leaned slightly against his shoulder, her warmth seeping into him. He hesitated only a moment before placing his arm around her, drawing her closer. The gesture was simple, wordless, but it carried the weight of everything they'd endured, the pain, the fear, the small, stubborn miracle of being alive together. As she drifted into sleep beside him, Josiah looked toward the mountains rising faintly against the starlit sky. They seemed impossibly far and yet within reach. Tomorrow they would climb higher into unknown country, leaving behind the ghosts that had once defined them. For now, though, the night belonged to quiet breaths, to soft earth beneath them, to the steady pulse of hearts learning to trust again. Somewhere beyond the horizon, danger waited, but so did redemption. He pressed his lips gently to her hair and whispered words that felt like a prayer, not to God, but to the universe that had seen fit to give him another chance. "We'll keep walking," he murmured. "One step, one dawn, until the light finds us." And in that tender silence, beneath the infinite sky, healing continued its slow, miraculous work, unseen, unstoppable, as constant as love itself. Dawn came soft and pale, like a whisper that didn't want to wake the world too soon. The night's chill lingered on the grass, beads of dew glinting faintly in the first light. Josiah stirred from sleep, the slow warmth of consciousness spreading through him as he became aware of the quiet weight against his shoulder. Nalin still slept beside him, her head resting lightly against his arm, strands of dark hair brushing his sleeve. For a long moment he simply watched her breathe, the rise and fall of her chest, the peaceful rhythm that had become the heartbeat of his mornings. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, faint threads of smoke curling into the cool air. He added a few sticks, coaxing the flame back to life, careful not to wake her. In that stillness, the world felt suspended, no sound but the crackle of fire, no danger near enough to touch. He realized how rare peace was and how fragile, yet how beautiful when it finally arrived. Healing, he thought, was not something grand. It was this, the quiet act of watching light return after too long in darkness. When Nalin woke, she smiled softly at the sight of him tending the fire. "You do this every morning," she said, her voice low and warm. "You bring back light." He met her gaze. "Maybe I just don't like the cold." "Or maybe," she said, "you like beginnings." He didn't answer, but her words stayed with him, gliding through his chest like a gentle wind that stirred something long dormant. They packed their things and continued north, following the faint trail that wound through the hills. The land began to change, dotted now with taller pines, and the scent of resin replaced the desert's dust. The air grew cooler, sharper, but clearer too. A clean kind of cold that felt alive against the skin. Nalin walked beside him, her stride steady despite the bruises that had not fully faded. She had grown stronger with each passing day, her silence less guarded, her eyes softer when they rested on him. By midday, they reached a narrow pass that opened into a small valley. A stream cut through the center, glinting like a ribbon of glass beneath the sun. They stopped to rest by the water, filling their canteens and washing the dust from their faces. Josiah watched as Nalin knelt by the edge, cupping her hands to drink. The water ran through her fingers in shining threads, catching the light like strands of silver. For an instant, she looked like she belonged entirely to this place, wild, unbroken, luminous. "You look at the world as if it's new to you," he said quietly. She smiled without turning. "Every day we live is new. Even pain changes its color." He crouched beside her. "And what color is it now?" She thought for a moment. "Like the sky before rain," she said. "Not bright, not dark, waiting." He nodded, unable to look away. Maybe waiting is what healing looks like. She glanced at him then, her eyes reflecting the water's shimmer. "And what do you wait for, Josiah Caldwell?" He hesitated, the truth slipping out before he could shape it into something safer. "For the feeling that I've done something right." "You already have," she said softly. The simplicity of her voice carried more grace than any sermon he'd ever heard. It touched him deeper than he could admit. He turned away before she could see the emotion in his eyes. They stayed by the stream for an hour, letting the sunlight soak through their bones. When they finally moved on, the world seemed changed, lighter somehow, as if it too had exhaled. By late afternoon, they came upon a small cabin nestled among the trees, smoke rising faintly from its chimney. It was humble. One room, a stone hearth, a small corral beside it. Josiah tensed at the sight of smoke. Someone's home, he murmured. Nalin studied the cabin carefully. Perhaps a friend of your friend. Perhaps. He recalled Walter's words, Margaret Dawson, the woman who might help. He hoped his friend's trust had not been misplaced. As they approached, a voice called from the porch. "That's far enough." A tall woman stood there, silver hair pulled back in a braid, a shotgun steady in her hands. "State your business." Josiah raised his hands slowly. "Name's Josiah Caldwell. Walter Reed sent us. Said you might offer shelter." The woman's eyes narrowed. "He did he?" "And who's the lady?" Nalin stepped forward slightly, her posture proud but calm. "My name is Nalin." Recognition flickered in the woman's eyes, not surprise, but understanding. "You're the one Hayes is hunting." Nalin didn't deny it. "I am the one they wronged." A long silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, the woman lowered her gun. "My name's Margaret Dawson. Walter's my brother. If he sent you, I'll trust his judgment. Come in before someone else sees that smoke." Relief washed through Josiah, though he kept his gratitude quiet. They followed her inside. The cabin was small but warm, smelling faintly of herbs and wood smoke. Books lined one shelf. Dried flowers hung from another. Margaret moved briskly, setting out cups of tea, her every motion practical yet kind. "You both look worn thin," she said, studying them. "Rest here tonight. Tomorrow we'll decide what comes next." Nalin inclined her head. "You are kind." "Just decent," Margaret replied. The world could use more of that. Over supper, they told her part of their story. Enough to make sense, not enough to endanger anyone. Margaret listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable until the end. "Hayes," she said at last, the name like something bitter on her tongue. "That man's cruelty has deep roots. You're right to run." "You know him?" Josiah asked. "Everyone does, one way or another. I lost someone to his kind of justice." She didn't elaborate, and he didn't press. Later that night, after Margaret had retired to her small cot by the fire, Josiah and Nalin sat outside beneath a sky flooded with stars. The forest whispered around them, branches sighing, a stream murmuring nearby. The moon hung low and bright, silvering the edges of everything it touched. "It feels different here," Nalin said. "The land breathes slower." He nodded. "Maybe it's a place that remembers peace." She looked at him, her face softened by the moonlight. "You carry too much weight on your back, Josiah Caldwell. You think every hurt must have been your fault." He opened his mouth to protest, then stopped. She was right. "I couldn't save them," he said at last. "Elizabeth, Sarah, I got there too late. I've carried that ever since." She turned toward him fully. "You cannot heal what you refuse to forgive." "Forgive myself?" "Yes." He laughed softly, without humor. "I wouldn't know where to begin." "Begin by remembering that love never dies. The ones who loved you, they want peace for you." Her words pressed gently against the deepest wound he had. Something inside him trembled, a wall cracking after years of holding firm. "You speak like you've known loss." She looked down, her fingers tracing patterns on her skirt. "I have. My mother, my kin, my village, burned by those who said they came for peace. I wanted vengeance for a long time, but vengeance poisons the hand that holds it. So I learned to pray for healing instead. He was quiet a long time. "And does it work?" Her eyes lifted to meet his. "It brought me here, didn't it?" That simple truth broke something open in him. The night felt endless, holy in its stillness. He reached out without thinking, his hand brushing against hers. She didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined naturally, like threads that had always meant to meet. Neither spoke for a while. The only sound was the slow, steady rhythm of two hearts learning to breathe together. When the chill deepened, she leaned closer, resting against him. He felt her warmth seep into him, steady and sure, like a promise that needed no words. The stars seemed to burn brighter then, as if bearing witness. In that vast wilderness, surrounded by shadows and uncertainty, something unspoken bloomed between them, tender, patient, alive. For Josiah, it wasn't the beginning of passion, but of peace, the kind that eases the ache from the inside, the kind that whispers, "You can still love, even after loss." For Nalin, it was trust, something she had long forgotten how to feel. When they finally returned inside, the fire had burned low, casting a soft orange glow across the small room. Margaret stirred, but didn't wake. They spread their blankets near the hearth, the warmth of it wrapping around them like quiet mercy. Before sleep claimed him, Josiah turned his head slightly and whispered, "Thank you." "For what?" she murmured, half asleep. "For reminding me what it feels like to live." She smiled in the dim light. "And what does it feel like?" "Like breathing after a long storm." Her eyes fluttered closed, her lips curving softly. "Then keep breathing." And he did, deeply, quietly, as dawn began to paint the window with silver. In the stillness of that small mountain cabin, two wounded hearts found a rhythm that was neither old nor new, only true. Healing came not through forgetting, but through remembering what it meant to stay, to believe again, to love without asking for anything in return. Outside, the forest swayed gently in the wind, whispering its approval. The first light of morning crept across the sky, turning shadows into gold. It was the kind of dawn that made a man believe, if only for a heartbeat, that peace wasn't a dream, but something that could be chosen. Again and again, one sunrise at a time. The next morning rose pale and tender, the kind of morning that carried the hush of something sacred. Mist floated between the trees, catching the faint light like ribbons of silk. Inside Margaret's cabin, the air smelled of coffee and pine smoke. Josiah woke to its warmth, to the soft murmur of voices outside, two women speaking low, calm, steady. For a fleeting moment, he thought he was back in his old home, hearing Elizabeth and little Sarah by the hearth, and the echo of that memory pressed gently against his chest before dissolving into the quiet present. When he stepped outside, the forest shimmered under dew. Margaret knelt in the small herb garden near the cabin, pulling weeds with patient hands. Nalin sat beside her, sleeves rolled up, hair braided neatly down her back. Their laughter, quiet, genuine, rose between the soft rustle of leaves. The sight rooted him in place. It had been years since laughter, so simple and unguarded, had lived near him. Margaret looked up first. "You sleep like a man who hasn't in a while," she said, a smile creasing the weathered lines around her eyes. "I did," he admitted, his voice rough with sleep. "First time in years I didn't wake from ghosts." "Ghosts don't like honest company," she said, returning to her work. Nalin brushed the soil from her hands, glancing at him. "We were speaking of plants," she said softly, "of the ways the earth teaches patience." "And what did it teach you?" he asked, moving closer. She smiled faintly. "That healing takes time and care. You cannot force a root to grow by pulling it." He watched the light dance across her face and felt something settle inside him. There was truth in her words, one he'd resisted for too long. Healing had never been about forgetting. It was about tending to what still lived. After breakfast, Margaret spread a small map across the table. Her hands, though lined and strong, moved with the grace of habit. "We'll have to move soon," she said. "Hayes won't stop. His patrols will reach these woods within a week." Josiah's jaw tightened. "You think he'll search here?" "I know him," she said simply. "And men like him don't let go of pride once it's bruised. You and Nalin will have to cross the mountains north. From there, she'll know the land." Nalin's eyes met hers. "I can find my brother," she said. "His camp moves often, but he won't be far from White Cliff Canyon." Margaret nodded. "Then that's where you'll go." The decision sat heavy on the air, final and necessary. Josiah folded the map carefully. "When do we leave?" "Tomorrow," Margaret replied. "The storm that's coming tonight will mask your trail." The rest of the day passed in quiet preparation. They packed dried food, flint, water skins, and bandages. Nalin moved through each task with calm determination. Her wounds had healed enough for travel, though Josiah still caught her holding her ribs when she thought no one noticed. Margaret brewed salves for her side, pressing the small jar into Josiah's hand before nightfall. "Use it if the pain worsens," she said. "And don't mistake silence for strength. Sometimes the strong are the ones who let others care for them." Outside, clouds were gathering, grey and heavy with promise. The wind carried the scent of rain, cool and metallic. Inside, the cabin felt wrapped in warmth. They ate together at the table, the flicker of the oil lamp painting soft gold over their faces. Conversation was gentle, interwoven with pauses that needed no filling. When the meal was done, Margaret rose and went to the window. "It's time I turned in," she said. "The mountains will test you, but they'll also keep you safe. They've seen too much death to allow more easily." Nalin touched her hand. "You have given us more than shelter." Margaret's expression softened. "Sometimes kindness is the only weapon left to us." As she disappeared into her small room, the cabin grew quiet again. Nalin sat near the fire, combing through her long hair, the simple motion mesmerizing. Josiah sat across from her, watching the flames. Their light made her skin glow, turned the shadows in her hair into threads of night. "I will miss her," Nalin said after a while. "She reminds me of my wife," he replied. "The same strength disguised as gentleness." Nalin looked at him, her eyes luminous in the firelight. "Tell me about her." He hesitated, then began softly. "Elizabeth was laughter, always humming, always turning every chore into song. She had hands that could mend anything, a torn shirt, a broken heart. When the sickness came, I wasn't there. I was away tending others. By the time I returned—" His voice trailed off. Nalin's voice was tender, steady. "You carry her still." "I try to," he said. "But grief makes poor company. It wants everything for itself." She reached across the small space between them, placing her hand over his. The touch was light but sure. "Then share it," she said. "Let someone else hold part of it, even if only for a while." He turned his palm upward, their fingers intertwining naturally. For the first time, the memory of Elizabeth didn't ache. It felt like warmth spreading through the quiet. The rain came in the night, soft at first, then heavy and insistent, drumming on the roof like the sound of old sorrow washing clean. They didn't speak. They simply listened, each breath a quiet prayer to something greater than words. The world outside blurred into sound and rhythm, a hymn of release. At dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape washed new. The air smelled of pine and wet soil, and the mountains stood veiled in silver mist. Margaret was already awake, boiling water for coffee. "The trails will be muddy," she said, "but that'll work in your favor. Fewer tracks to follow." Josiah loaded their packs, tightening the straps on the mule. Nalin adjusted the shawl around her shoulders. When Margaret stepped out, she handed her a small pouch of herbs. "For strength and calm," she said. Then to Josiah, "You'll know when to use them." He nodded, gratitude tightening his throat. "Thank you. For everything." Margaret smiled faintly. "Don't thank me yet. Come back alive, and then we'll speak of gratitude." They embraced briefly, and then it was time. The path wound steeply upward, disappearing into the morning fog. Josiah turned back once, watching Margaret's small figure framed in the doorway. She raised a hand, her silhouette strong against the soft light, and he knew it was both farewell and blessing. The climb was hard, the air thinning as they rose higher. The world narrowed to breath, step, and heartbeat. Nalin moved with quiet endurance, her gaze fixed ahead. Every so often Josiah offered her water, his concern unspoken but constant. The forest around them was alive with scent and sound, the rustle of animals in undergrowth, the distant call of hawks. It was wild, untouched, indifferent to men and their wars. By midday the sun broke through the mist, spilling gold over the mountainside. They stopped by a ledge overlooking a valley below. From here, the world seemed vast and endless. Josiah sat down, catching his breath. Nalin stood near the edge, wind tugging at her braid. "Do you ever wonder," she said quietly, "if people could be like rivers? To change shape, to keep moving, yet always remain themselves?" He thought of it, watching the thin silver line of a stream below. "Maybe that's what we're doing now, learning how to flow again." She smiled. "Then we are both rivers." He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't hesitate. The warmth of her fingers was steady, grounding. Around them, the wind whispered through the pines like a voice from another age. They camped that night near a small spring. The air was cool and clean, the stars sharp and close enough to touch. Josiah built a small fire, while Nalin gathered herbs nearby. When she returned, she brewed a tea from the leaves, the scent soothing and sweet. "For the heart," she said when she handed him the cup. To keep it from growing tired, he sipped, and the warmth spread through him, easing the ache in his limbs. "You know a great deal about healing," he said. Her gaze softened. "It is what I was before the soldiers came, a healer among my people. They called me the one who listens to the earth. You still are, he said. You've been healing me since the day we met. A shy smile touched her lips. Perhaps we are healing each other. The fire burned low, casting long shadows. The world felt suspended between heartbeats. He looked at her then, not as the woman he had rescued, but as the woman who had resurrected something in him he thought long buried. "Nalin," he said quietly, "when this ends, if it ends, what will you do?" She stared into the flames. "I will go home. If my brother still lives, I will stand beside him. But I no longer wish for vengeance. I wish for peace." He nodded. "And if peace never comes, then I will keep walking toward it," she said simply. He admired her strength, her faith in something the world had done its best to destroy. "You make me believe it's possible," he said. She turned to him, eyes luminous in the firelight. "That is what love does," she whispered. "It teaches us to believe again." He didn't move. He didn't speak. He only looked at her, the space between them charged with something that pulsed and breathed. When he finally reached out, his hand trembled slightly, not with doubt, but with reverence. She met him halfway, her fingers finding his, their hands fitting as if they had been waiting all their lives. The kiss that followed was soft, hesitant, a promise more than a declaration. The taste of rain lingered in the air, and when they finally parted, the silence between them was full, alive, like a prayer answered in the simplest way possible. They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. The fire burned low, the stars wheeled slowly overhead, and the world, for once, was kind. When dawn came, it found them side by side, wrapped in the same blanket, the mountain wind brushing gently across their faces. The road ahead was uncertain, but the fear had lessened. They had already crossed a greater distance, the one between two lonely hearts, learning at last that even in a world scarred by loss, love could still grow, quietly and without permission, like wild flowers blooming from the ashes. And as they broke camp and began the long climb toward the next ridge, Josiah realized that the ache inside him had changed shape. It was no longer an emptiness to fill, but a pulse to follow. Each step forward was a step toward life, toward light, toward something beautifully unknown. The wind carried the scent of pine and rain, and behind them the world they'd left was already fading into memory. Ahead lay danger, perhaps hope. But walking beside Nalin, Josiah finally understood that healing was not the end of the story. It was the journey itself, written quietly in every shared breath, every sunrise, every heartbeat that dared to begin again. The morning began with the kind of silence that makes the heart listen. The wind had softened, the earth still damp from the storm, and a thin thread of mist wove between the pines. Josiah woke before the light fully broke, the warmth of Nalin's presence beside him, a quiet anchor in the cold. Her hand rested loosely near his, fingers curled as if still reaching for something even in sleep. For a moment, he simply watched the rhythm of her breathing, the gentle rise and fall that made the world seem whole again. When the first pale light touched the horizon, she stirred. Her dark eyes opened slowly, calm and steady, meeting his gaze without surprise. The day ahead held danger, they both knew it. But in that small stillness before movement, there was no fear. Only the fragile peace that comes from knowing one is no longer alone. They broke camp in silence, each movement sure and practiced. Margaret's map guided them higher through the ridges, where the trees thinned and the air grew sharper. The world seemed to open in layers, the deep blue of distant mountains, the shimmer of hidden streams below, and above, a sky so wide it felt like forgiveness itself. By mid-morning they reached a rocky plateau overlooking a valley bathed in gold. From here the trail would curve toward White Cliff Canyon, where Margaret had said her sister's people sometimes traveled. The climb had left Josiah breathless, but Nalin moved with unshaken grace. The mountain belonged to her in a way it never could to him. Her feet found the earth's rhythm effortlessly. When they paused to rest, she crouched by a patch of wild sage, crushing a few leaves between her fingers. The air filled with its clean, calming scent. "My mother used to burn this," she said. "For strength, for clear dreams." Josiah inhaled deeply, the aroma washing through him like memory. "Then we'll carry some," he said. "Maybe it'll keep our path safe." She smiled faintly and tied a bundle with a thin strip of cloth, slipping it into his pack. The small act felt sacred, like a blessing offered not with words, but with trust. By noon, clouds gathered once more, bruised with rain. They pressed on, the path narrowing to a series of steep switchbacks. The air was thin enough to sting the lungs, and every breath came sharp. At times, Josiah faltered, his legs trembling from fatigue, but Nalin was there, steady, patient, guiding him with a touch at his arm. "Slow," she said once, her voice low, soothing. "The mountain forgives no haste." They reached a small plateau before the storm broke. Nalin pointed toward the horizon, where, far below, a silver river wound through a canyon's pale stone. "White Cliff," she said. "Beyond it, the valley of my people." It was closer than he'd expected, yet still days away. The thought filled him with both relief and unease. Each mile north brought them nearer to her home, and nearer to parting. He pushed the thought aside, but it stayed, like a thorn beneath the skin. The first raindrops fell cold and heavy. They took shelter beneath a rocky overhang. The storm came suddenly, sweeping across the mountains in sheets. Wind howled through the pines, and thunder cracked so close it made the earth shudder. They huddled together in the narrow space, the damp chill biting through their clothes. Josiah pulled his coat tighter around her shoulders. "Here," he said, voice rough from the wind. "It's warmer this way." She accepted silently, her hands trembling slightly from the cold. Their faces were inches apart, breaths mingling, the air between them charged with unspoken things. The storm roared on, wild and relentless, but in their small refuge there was stillness, a heartbeat shared between them, steady and alive. When lightning split the sky, Nalin flinched, pressing closer instinctively. His arm wrapped around her without thought. Her body was cold, her heart quick against his chest. He whispered something without realizing it, words he hadn't used since before grief hollowed him out. "You're safe," he murmured, as though the promise could summon warmth. She tilted her head, her eyes luminous in the flashes of light. "You speak like the storm listens to you." "Maybe it listens to you," he said softly. "You're the one it hasn't touched." For a moment, they both smiled. The storm raged outside, but inside the narrow shelter, something shifted, an understanding too quiet to name. They stayed that way until the thunder began to fade and the rain softened to a whisper. When it finally ended, the world smelled new. The air was thick with petrichor, the sky torn open to reveal the late afternoon sun. They emerged from their refuge, clothes damp but spirits lighter. Water ran down the rocks in gleaming rivulets, catching sunlight like liquid glass. They descended into a valley blooming with life. Wildflowers bent beneath droplets, the air alive with the hum of insects newly awakened by rain. It felt like walking through a prayer. Josiah couldn't help but marvel at it, the resilience of the earth, how quickly it could forgive. "You see," Nalin said, sensing his awe, "even the hardest land can bloom again." He looked at her. "And people too?" Her smile was small but certain. "Especially people." That night they camped near a grove of aspens, their white trunks gleaming ghost-like under the rising moon. The air was cool, and the fire crackled softly, its glow reflecting in Nalin's dark eyes. She sat close, mending a tear in her shawl with careful fingers. Her movements were quiet, deliberate, every stitch carrying patience. Josiah watched her hands, the way they moved as if guided by something unseen. "You've done this before," he said. She nodded. "For others, long ago. My brother, our people. Every thread meant protection." He hesitated. "And for me?" She glanced up, her eyes warm. "For you, I sow hope." The words slipped into him like light through cracks in stone. He looked away, overwhelmed by the simplicity of her gift. Healing didn't need grand gestures. Sometimes it lived in small acts done with love. When she finished, she draped the mended shawl around both of them, its woven fabric soft against his cheek. They sat that way, shoulders touching, the night humming with quiet intimacy. "I don't know what waits for us ahead," Josiah said, after a long while, "but I know I'm not afraid any more." "Then the journey has already changed you," Nalin replied. "Fear is the first thing the heart must release before it can love again." He turned to her, catching the faint glimmer of moonlight in her eyes. "And you, Nalin? What has this journey changed in you?" She was silent for a moment, searching for words. "I used to carry anger like a weapon. I thought it kept me strong, but now I see it only made me heavy. You have taught me that gentleness is not weakness." He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You've taught me the same." Their eyes held, steady, full of something deeper than mere gratitude. There was longing there, but also peace, the kind born from shared pain and mutual recognition. When he leaned forward, she didn't move away. The kiss that found them was tender and unhurried, a meeting of hearts that had learned patience. It wasn't desperate, it was healing, the kind that mended what words never could. Afterward, she rested her head against his chest, listening to his heartbeat. "This sound," she whispered, "it reminds me that even after loss, life continues." He pressed his lips to her hair. "It does," he said, "and maybe it begins again too." The fire burned low, and stars filled the clearing, bright and endless. He traced one gently against the sky. "When we reach your brother," he said quietly, "will he understand?" Her voice softened. "He will see my heart, and I will tell him you saved me." "I don't think I did," Josiah said. "You saved yourself. I just gave you time to breathe." She smiled, her hand finding his. "Then we saved each other." The night deepened, wrapping them in stillness. Somewhere far off, an owl called, a lonely, soothing sound that carried through the trees. The world around them seemed to breathe slower, its pulse matching theirs. Josiah stared into the fire until it dimmed to embers. He thought of how far they had come, of the man who once lived only in shadow, now sitting beneath the stars with warmth in his chest. The journey had changed more than their paths. It had rewritten what it meant to belong. When dawn came, it painted the sky in pinks and golds, light falling through the aspens like liquid fire. They rose together, the cold air biting but clean. Nalin tied her braid, slinging her pack over her shoulder. Josiah adjusted the straps on the mule. The world waited before them, vast and unknown, yet neither felt fear. As they began to walk, he looked back once, seeing the faint traces of smoke from their fire curling into the morning sky. It reminded him of everything they'd left behind: pain, guilt, loneliness, and everything they carried forward. Trust, tenderness, the slow, quiet miracle of healing. The path narrowed between the trees, but their steps were sure, their rhythm in perfect harmony. He reached out, took her hand again, and this time she didn't let go. The mountains rose before them, immense and beautiful, their peaks shining with new snow. Somewhere beyond lay her people, her brother, and whatever awaited them next. But in that moment, walking side by side through the living silence of the dawn, they were not fugitives or lost souls. They were simply two hearts traveling the same road toward the same sunrise. And as the light spilled over the ridge, warming their faces, Josiah felt something inside him ease completely. It wasn't triumph or certainty, it was peace. The quiet kind that comes after the hardest season, when you realize that the wounds you carried were never meant to end you, only to teach you how to feel again. He squeezed her hand gently, his voice low. "We're almost there." Nalin looked ahead, her eyes full of that calm fire he had come to love. "Yes," she said. "Almost." The wind swept through the trees, carrying their footprints forward, erasing the old trail behind. And together they walked into the waiting light, their shadows merging, their souls unburdened, as the world whispered its soft approval, healing, love, and the endless promise of beginning again. The next dawn broke over the high cliffs in waves of rose and gold. Mist curled like breath from the sleeping earth, and the first light brushed the mountains with the gentleness of a whispered promise. Josiah stirred awake to the soft crackle of the fire dying down to embers, the faint scent of sage still clinging to the air. Beside him, Nalin was already awake, her dark eyes watching the sky shift colors. She seemed woven into the morning itself, quiet, steady, alive in a way that made the world feel new. They had spent the night near the ridge overlooking White Cliff Canyon, where the river below wound like a silver thread through the vast silence. It was a sight that could humble even the most hardened man, and Josiah stood for a long time just breathing it in, the cool air filling his chest with something clean. "It's beautiful," he murmured, as if the words could reach the horizon. Nalin nodded. "This place remembers," she said softly. "Every wind that touches these stones carries the stories of those who came before us. Their pain, their prayers, their healing. The word hung between them like a benediction. Healing. It had followed them through every trial, every mile of desert and storm. And now it was here, in the stillness of dawn, as if the land itself had exhaled relief. They ate a simple breakfast by the dying fire, bread, dried meat, water from the stream. Every movement between them carried an unspoken rhythm, the ease of two souls who had stopped being strangers long ago. When the meal was done, Nalin wrapped her shawl tighter and pointed north. "From here we follow the river until it forks," she said. "And beyond it lies the valley of my people. If Takakota still lives, he will find us." Josiah looked at her, reading the mixture of hope and fear in her voice. "And if he doesn't? Then I will walk on," she replied. "There will always be another sunrise to follow." They began the descent into the canyon as the sun climbed higher. The path was steep and narrow, carved by centuries of wind and rain. Josiah led the mule carefully, his boots scraping against loose stone. The air grew warmer, filled with the scent of pine and damp earth. As they walked, Nalin spoke of her childhood, of the songs her mother used to sing, of nights spent by the fire while her brother told stories about the stars. Her voice was soft, full of warmth, and Josiah listened as if every word might vanish if he breathed too loudly. "Do you miss it?" he asked quietly. "I miss the sound of belonging," she said, "the way laughter carried across the camp like music. The way we knew who we were without needing to be told." He nodded. "I used to know that too, back before the war, back before I started burying everything I loved." Nalin's eyes softened. "You have found it again," she said. "Here, with me, with the earth beneath your feet. Healing is not forgetting. It is remembering differently." They walked for hours, the sun shifting overhead. By afternoon, the canyon opened into a wide valley lush with green. It felt almost impossible. After weeks of barren trail, here was life in abundance. Wild flowers painted the meadows, and a stream ran clear and cold, reflecting the light like glass. Birds darted through the branches above, their calls echoing faintly between the cliffs. Nalin stopped, her gaze sweeping across the valley. "We are close," she said. Her voice trembled slightly, though whether from joy or fear, Josiah couldn't tell. He placed a hand on her shoulder. "Whatever waits ahead, you don't face it alone." She looked up at him, eyes glistening in the sunlight. "You speak as if you mean to stay." "I do," he said simply, "for as long as you'll have me." They reached the river's fork by dusk. There they made camp beneath the shelter of a rock ledge. The air was cool and sweet, the sound of running water like a lullaby. As the fire flickered to life, Nalin sat beside him, her gaze distant. "When I see my brother," she said, "he may not understand. He will see only an outsider, a man of the blue coats who brought sorrow to our people." Josiah nodded. "Then let him see what you see in me." Her lips curved faintly. "And what is that?" He hesitated, then spoke with quiet honesty. "A man who has finally learned that kindness can be stronger than war." The flames caught her face in a warm glow, and for the first time he saw tears shimmer in her eyes. She reached for his hand, and the small gesture held more power than any vow. "You have a healer's soul," she whispered. "Even when you forget, it remembers." The night wrapped around them like a quilt of silver and shadow. They talked until the stars climbed high, sharing stories, fragments of dreams, silences that spoke louder than words. And when she leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder, he felt something shift deep within, a quiet certainty that his wandering had ended. He was home, though no walls or borders could define it. Morning came soft and golden. They crossed the river, following the path that wound through a grove of cottonwoods. The air was thick with the sound of insects and birds, and Josiah's heart beat fast with anticipation. Near midday, the sound of distant voices reached them. Nalin stopped, every muscle in her body tightening. From the trees ahead, figures emerged. 5 riders, their horses sleek and painted with tribal markings. The men moved with the grace of those born to the land. Their faces were sharp, wary. At their head rode a tall man whose features mirrored Nalin's, though hardened by years and grief. "Takakota," she breathed. The chief dismounted slowly, eyes flicking between his sister and Josiah. The tension was thick, sharp as drawn steel. Nalin stepped forward first. She spoke in her own tongue, her voice trembling but clear. The words flowed like water, urgent, heartfelt, heavy with meaning. Josiah couldn't understand them, but he could feel their weight. He stood still, his rifle slung harmlessly over his shoulder, his hands open at his sides. When she finished, the chief was silent for a long moment. Then he approached Josiah, eyes dark and unreadable. "You saved her," he said in halting English. Josiah inclined his head. "She saved me too." Takakota's gaze lingered on him, measuring, judging, perhaps remembering his own share of mercy. Finally, he nodded once. "You will come to our camp," he said. "We will speak." Relief loosened the breath in Josiah's chest. Together, they followed the riders through the valley until they reached a cluster of lodges near a grove of cottonwoods. Smoke curled gently from the fires, and children paused their play to watch the newcomers. The camp felt alive, sorrow and joy interwoven like any human place. That night, Josiah sat beside Nalin as her brother and the elders gathered around the central fire. The flames painted the circle of faces in shifting amber and shadow. They spoke long into the night, of peace, of forgiveness, of the long road between 2 wounded nations. Josiah listened, humbled, offering only the truth when it was asked of him. He spoke of what he had seen, of the cruelty of war, of his belief that healing could only begin when people laid down their hate. When he finished, silence fell. Then Takakota rose. "A man who listens is worth more than an army that shouts," he said. "You will stay here as friend. Tomorrow we send word to the fort. There will be talks, not of surrender, but of peace." The decision rippled through the camp like wind through grass. For the first time in decades, hope stirred, a fragile thing, but alive. Nalin turned to Josiah, tears glinting in her eyes. "You see," she whispered, "the earth always finds its way back to balance." Later, after the fire had burned low and the camp had quieted, they walked to the edge of the valley where the river shimmered beneath the moon. The air was cool, full of night sounds. She stood beside him, her shawl fluttering lightly in the breeze. "I never thought I'd live to see this," she said. "Peace is a dream my people stopped daring to speak aloud." Maybe dreams just need someone to believe in them again, Josiah said. She looked at him then, truly looked, and in her eyes he saw everything he had lost and everything he had found. "Will you stay?" she asked. He reached for her hand. "As long as I'm welcome. As long as I can help build something worth leaving behind." She smiled through her tears. "Then you are welcome. Always." The moonlight caught her face, soft and radiant. When he kissed her, it was not with urgency, but with reverence, the kind of kiss that belongs not to passion alone, but to gratitude, to the quiet miracle of two souls finding home after too much wandering. They stood there for a long time, wrapped in silence, the river whispering beside them. And though the world beyond still carried its storms, within that valley there was calm, a beginning shaped from ruin, a healing born from love. Josiah looked out at the distant horizon, the faint glow of dawn already touching its edge. "Tomorrow," he said softly, "we start again." "Yes," Nalin answered, her voice steady and full of light. "Tomorrow we begin the healing." The night settled around them like a blessing, stars reflected in the river's surface. Two hearts, once broken, now beat in rhythm with the land, proof that even in the aftermath of loss, life could rise again, tender and unafraid. If this story brought you warmth, a little peace, or a flicker of hope, let your heart leave a trace behind. Leave a comment to share your thoughts, subscribe to follow the journey, and press like if the words touched something quiet within you. Every little sign of kindness keeps stories like this alive.